I'm very excited to have you all here and to have Marty Sliwinski here to talk with us. I want to give special thank you to the Provost Lecture Series for sponsoring this, as well as the Program in Public Health, the Department of Psychology, and the Aging Interest Group here at Stony Brook. Marty is a professor of human development and family studies at Penn State, and he's director of the Center on Healthy Aging there. Previously, he was a professor at Syracuse as well as at Einstein College of Medicine. He did his bachelor's at Georgetown University and his PhD in neuropsychology at CUNY. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Society as well as the Gerontological Society of America. And across his career has been really productive, both in terms of publications as well as grants, including RO1s, PO1s, and U grants, with a focus on cognitive aging and stress, and on the development of methods, including measurements, as well as analytic approaches to capture both individual differences in risk for cognitive decline, but also within-person fluctuations representing potential moments of risk, which are promising early indicators of decline, as well as potential targets for early intervention. And today, he's going to be presenting to us some of his exciting work, bringing these sensitive assessments of performance out of the lab and into the wild, into the everyday context where we live and work. And so I'm really excited about his presentation, which will be on Cognition on the Go, Opportunities and Challenges for Mobile Cognitive Health Research. So please join me in welcoming Marty.
It's been a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and I've just had such an enjoyable time so far today. And I suggested we should be doing reverse colloquium, where I stand up here and get to hear about all the interesting things you guys do in the audience. But it's been great so far, and I look forward to more conversations afterwards. And I'm very excited to be here and have this opportunity to talk about some of the research that my colleagues and I, Stacy's been part of this from the very beginning, that we've been doing over the last several years in figuring out how to use these things, mobile phones, to provide high precision measurements of cognitive function in uncontrolled settings that are self-administered by participants. Three main goals today, to answer three different questions. The first is, why in the world would we want to try and figure out how to measure cognitive function using smartphones? So we're going to talk a little bit about the rationale. I'm going to do this in the context of 2 lines of research, or 2.5 lines of research, by trying to answer the question of whether or not, if we do want to do this, can we do it? Can we obtain reliable and valid measurements? And we'll provide some evidence in the context of cognitive aging, the effects of stress on cognitive performance, and some hot off the presses work from the Einstein Aging Study looking at how we can use these tools to improve the discrimination of people with mild cognitive impairment at risk for Alzheimer's disease. And then we'll conclude with a little bit of information about how, if you're persuaded by anything I talk about, you could begin thinking about incorporating mobile measurements of cognitive function into your research. So we're going to talk about an infrastructure grant we have to develop the platform for doing this that we can share. Okay. So the most common reasons that people cite for doing any kind of mobile assessments of health, and in particular cognitive function, are that by removing constraints imposed by geography, space, and personnel, it's possible to obtain larger and more diverse samples, hard-to-reach samples, than we could if we require people to come into the lab. So a good friend and colleague of mine, Jason Hassenstab, is using some of the techniques I'll be talking about as part of a large worldwide clinical trial on dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease. So this is a condition that affects a very small percentage of those with Alzheimer's disease, and they need to go all over the world to get enough people. So mobile assessments help with that. We can also, instead of talking about sample sizes of a few hundred, we can talk about potentially tens of thousands of people. Less cited reasons, but also very strong motivations for trying to move assessments of cognitive function into naturalistic settings is to try and improve ecological validity. So when we test people or assess them in laboratory settings, we forget that we're engaging people in a social transaction where the tester is the host and the participant is the guest. It's also, the settings in the lab are very, very dissimilar to people's environments that they encounter in everyday life. And with mobile measurements, we can maybe get a better representation of situation states as they unfold in naturalistic contexts. But the most important reason, at least that I think, and what I'm going to be talking about today, is that using mobile methods permits us to increase the frequency of repeated testing, so we can test people more frequently. So instead of just 1 or 2 repeated measurements, we can do 80, 90, hundreds of repeated assessments distributed over time. And this allows us to boost temporal precision, so we know what's happening when, so we can do better measurements. But it also permits us to examine intra-individual variability, both in terms of canceling it out, to get high precision assessments of people's level of functioning, as well as to look at that intra-individual variability as a possible signal for some important outcomes we might be trying to predict. So what I'm going to be describing today focuses mainly on the advantage of increased frequency of repeated testing. So to put this in context and how I thought about this, I want to just very briefly describe the typical approach that people use to studying cognitive change, or change in any kind of variable, really, and this is in the context of cognitive aging. So typically what we do is we will bring people into the lab or the clinic and test them once and say, this is now the measurement that represents where you were at, how you were doing this one-time assessment. And then, if we want to track change over time, what do? We bring people back again for another assessment. It could be a year later, and then we do this over some period of time. This allows us to study, or we think it allows us to study well, long-term changes that unfold over the course of years, representing the spacing between the assessments. This is what I refer to and others refer to as a longitudinal single-shot design, because each assessment comprises of a single-shot one-time measurement. Now, when you think about the length and duration of projects, which are determined largely by the money we can get to run our projects, which come from the National Institute of Health, and they have decided 5 years is the maximum you can be funded. What this typically means is that we can get about 3 years of follow-up if we're really efficient in terms of recruiting people, getting people into the study. So basically, we're thinking about studying change in people over the course of 3 years. What people, typically I'm referring to anyone, any adult, and looking at changes associated with an advancing age or with perhaps the early stages of a disease like dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So we're talking about looking at changes over 3 years. Now, this approach, and there's nothing really wrong with it, but it is built upon a few assumptions, and the one I want to talk a little bit about is the assumption of short-term stability. And that assumption means that if we bring people in and we measure them once, that's going to provide an accurate representation of their level of functioning at this time. Where I mean at this time, I mean baseline, right? Now, is this the case? Is this how we should think about change over time from a developmental or lifespan perspective, whether we're talking about cognition, emotion regulation, or any other type of ability? So to kind of understand the problem and where it emerges, I'd like to just present very briefly this heuristic model of change that a lot of us in working in this area follow. So, and the key take-home message here is that change transpires over multiple time scales. Now, we might be interested, if I study cognitive aging, you're interested in changes that occur across a lifespan from younger to older adults. So you might be thinking about change that manifests over the course of years or decades, which could be reflecting slow-acting processes like cortical thinning or amyloid deposition or the accumulation of different kinds of neuropathology. So let's say that's what you're interested in. So why do I need to pay attention to changes and variability that occur over a faster time scale? Well, because change doesn't look like that. I wish it did, because that's a nice, smooth function. In reality, if we would follow individuals over this time period, we might see an actual tracking of their functioning that followed the squiggly line. There might be periods where they do better than other times. Change is not monotonic. Developmental change is not monotonic, at least in adulthood. And those types of changes meaningfully might manifest over the course of weeks or months and be driven by completely different sets of causes, such as the onset and offset of chronic stressors or different kinds of disease conditions, such as inflammation. Right? But we can drill down to an even finer grained timescale. So we could look at fluctuations and variations in cognitive function that manifest over the course of days or even hours within a day. And then we can look at those ups and downs and say what are the reasons why a person might have an up or down from 1 hour to the next or one day to the next. And those could be having to do with variations in everyday stress, fatigue, or in the context that we'll be talking about, with mobile assessments, it could be having to do with the noise in their environment or the location in which they're doing the testing, their social company, right? So just because I'm an Alzheimer's researcher, let's say, and I'm interested in change that occurs over the course of years or decades, that doesn't render the changes that occur over shorter time scales non-existent or irrelevant. I can't wish them out of existence. These short-term variations will occur whether I want them to or not. And here's the problem. So the problem is, if we want to characterize an individual during a baseline period, their cognitive function, if we tested them at different days, different times, would exhibit some ups and downs. And we might happen to get a person on a bad day, right? Bad night's sleep, stressed, what have you, which might underestimate their typical performance that would be representative of their level of functioning during this baseline period. So short-term variation can create imprecision in the assessment or characterization of a person's status, which then is compounded if we want to do a longitudinal study where we wait, a year, right? And then we do another assessment, and there's also some variation, and then we get them on a good day. We happen to, and then if we look at change over time, it might look like their performance is getting better, whereas if we were to characterize their typical performance during the baseline and follow-up periods, on average, there would be a decrement in performance. So we refer to this as temporal sampling error. So this is deviations from an expected or a parameter you're trying to estimate due to the time at which you sampled them. So this type of short-term variability can reduce measurement precision and can obscure long-term change. Okay. So in the field of cognitive aging, this is really important. Why? Well, when you think of cognitive aging and you look at the effects that are published in cross-sectional studies, age correlations with memory and processing speed could be 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. But when you think about the change that's manifesting in an individual over time, think back to the NIH grant period, right? We have 3 years to detect change. So cognitive aging, I sometimes refer to as the field of small effects, right? So there was a meta-analysis done by Lipnicki where they, across a bunch of different studies, examined how much do people change cognitively associated with age. Well, over the course of a decade, between 0.1 and 0.26 standard deviations over that period of time. Now, you might say, well, that's a small effect, but I don't want to lose 0.2 standard deviations of my IQ. I don't have that to lose, but that is actually a noteworthy effect, right? And then over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 decades, you're talking about the equivalent of 15 IQ points, right? So aging, fortunately, exerts small effects in the short term, but cumulatively, those effects are certainly noticeable. Now let's reverse interpolate. So that means that the rate of change is about, and I hope I did this math correctly, about 0.01 to 0.03 standard deviation units per year. So that's a small effect, right? And then during an NIH grant period, that means we're trying to detect effects that are 0.03 to 0.09 standard deviation units, real small, right? And then we also want to look at individual differences in those teeny tiny effects. This is problematic. The effect sizes are even smaller in middle-aged samples, but not that much larger in people who are in the preclinical stages of Alzheimer's disease. So it's about, some of our studies, about 0.18 to 0.2 in individuals annual change. So that's still pretty small. There is a simulation study done by Philippe Rost and Scott Hofer where they said, based on what we see in the literature, to detect individuals, just like significant individual differences in change, to have adequate power, you need about 9 waves of assessment in over 1,600 people, and forget about it if you want to determine what predicts change or correlated change. You need up to 16 annual waves with about 1,600 people. And one of the arguments that they made is we can remedy this problem by improving the precision the precision of our estimates and our measurements at every wave, at every time point, right? So we can't make people, and we don't want to make people age faster, right? So we can't increase the effect size, but what we can do is reduce noise, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So basically, this is the problem we're trying to deal with when we study cognitive aging, virtually trying to find a needle in a haystack like this, because when you think of all the background noise that can be happening, trying to detect and measure that signal, and then look at the effective interventions on that signal, this is really highly problematic given how we do our measurements. Okay. So this is the conventional approach to doing longitudinal research, and there's an alternative approach that can be helpful, and that is using something called the measurement burst design, where instead of at each point of follow-up, we assess people one time, what we might do is repeated daily assessments, say maybe measure people once a day for 7 or 14 days, collect that information, a year later do that same burst of intensive measurements. This has a few advantages, right? It allows you to be able to look at short-term effects that manifest over the course of days or hours. So if you're interested in the effect of a bad night's sleep or sleep disruptions, you can examine that by looking at whether a bad night's sleep precedes and predicts a dip in cognitive performance from one day to the next. And then, of course, this can also help you look at long-term change in the following way. Going back to the good day, bad day figure I gave before, imagine if we actually could estimate those red dots by having repeated measurements. That can give us a more precise, more accurate estimate of functioning that allows us to assess change with greater precision over the course of time to where it might be possible to detect change over just a couple years of follow-up. So we can improve temporal precision by averaging out random variation, which can increase reliability and improve power. And I'll also talk about a little bit later in the talk, also giving us additional signal, not just reducing the noise, but giving us more signal that can maybe be used to distinguish between people with and without a certain kind of condition we're trying to detect. Another advantage, which I'm not going to talk too much about, but I could if there are people who do cognitive aging research and have some interest in this, it can actually help us address the elephant in the room, which is the problem of retest or practice. So whenever you give people a cognitive test, even if you give them different materials, they do better the second time, right? And the magnitude of those retest effects dwarf the decrement that we would expect to occur due to cognitive aging. So by doing measurement bursts affords us some strategies for overcoming this by trying to get people, train them to their asymptote at the beginning to look at levels, or apply psychometric cognitive processing models to estimate asymptote and distinguish decrements in a person's peak performance from improvements in their average performance due to practice. We have a model, so we published some data on this. It'll take me a little bit of time to explain that. I have the slides, so if people are interested in that, we can talk about that, the formal model that we did to do that. But those are some of the advantages of measurement bursts. Now, in this study, which sort of showed a proof of concept, we were able to detect and model significant variations in change with just 2 years of follow-up in 110 older adults. And the reason why we could do this is because we had measurement bursts that improved precision, but it was costly. Why did we only have 110 people? Because we brought them in to the lab for 6 days, pretty much in a row, and it's hard to do that, right? So this is where mobile technology comes in, right? Where we can make it a little bit easier to do these intensive assessments. There's a lot of research now being done trying to figure out how to use smartphones to assess cognitive function, and the whole area of digital biomarkers is taking off, so everyone's talking about these things. Our approach is different from a lot of people's approaches, where we sort of use mobile phones as a way to do ambulatory assessments. So we focus on real-time measurement in naturalistic settings, and we do this by embedding our cognitive tests on smartphones in the context of experience sampling protocols or ecological momentary assessment protocols, where what we do is we use mobile technology like smartphones. We have very brief cognitive performance tests. This is one I'll explain in a moment. And each assessment is, when I say brief, it's ultra brief, between 30 seconds and 60 seconds each time they do a test. We accompany these with real-time self-report assessments or passive sensing using wearables or using the internal sensors on the phone. And then the key feature is that this allows us to do testing on multiple days and multiple times per day. And the way to think about this If you can get people to do a cognitive test for 20 minutes, how do you want to use those 20 minutes? Do you want to use it all at once, where you bring them in and they do the test for 20 minutes? Or do you want to do 21-minute sessions that you distribute over the course of the week to where if you happen to get them on a bad day, that effect is minimized? And our view is that this latter approach is certainly worth investigating and seems to be paying off. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of the time is briefly summarize some early work and some new work that we're just doing right now that shows that we can do this and that there are some interesting benefits of trying to do these types of mobile cognitive assessments. So I'm going to present just a few results from one of the first studies that used this approach called ESCAPE, which stands for the Effects of Stress on Cognitive Aging, Physiology, and Emotion. So that looks just like the Bronx, right? That's Co-op City in the Bronx. It's built on a swamp. That's a very favorable picture of it. It looks almost like a resort. But what we did is we did a systematic sample of people residing in Co-op City because we wanted to control sort of residential status. So we had about 240 individuals aged 25 to 65. Okay. And then we did a measurement burst study in which people carried the phones around for 14 days, answered questions, survey questions in the morning and the evening, but then at 5 random times throughout the day, they were prompted to do the mobile cognitive assessments. Okay. So we'll show you some of the mobile cognitive tests we use. There are a lot of design considerations that we're working through. That they need to be brief, intuitive, and we need to do this in ways that discourage cheating. And this is one of our working memory tests. We call it dot memory or grid memory, where you see a 5x5 grid with 3 dots, study it for 3 seconds. You do a visual distractor task for 8 seconds, and then you have to indicate where you saw the dots. And the score is a Euclidean distance of how far off people were. And that's a nice test because it's pretty clear what you should be doing at each stage. You can't really forget the instructions. The other test that we've used is a processing speed test where we have individuals. Oh, wow, that's a weird thing. So we have individuals study the pairs of symbols on top and identify the pair on the bottom that matches the one on the top. And we use forced choice instead of yes, no, is it there or not, because as people get older, the response criterion differs, so forced choice kind of helps with that. Okay. So these are actual screenshots from our software. So the first thing we decided to do is to convince people that we can obtain reliable and valid assessments of cognitive function because, right, so psychologists are the most distrustful people in the world. They assume that anyone in our studies are out trying to game the system and are going to cheat. So what we want to do is say, is there evidence of that, or can we get sort of reliable performance that correlates with scores obtained in controlled settings in the lab, and then also that this whole idea of uncontrolled testing settings are bad, that there's too many distractions going on, and we certainly don't want people doing a cognitive test in that situation. But basically, do these two features of uncontrolled testing compromise the reliability and validity of the tests? So this is a question we asked, and we published a study where we showed that any given very brief assessment of cognitive function has reliabilities or intraclass correlation of about 0.39 in the case of the working memory test, or 0.54 in terms of symbol search. And this doesn't mean the test is a single assessment is unreliable. What it means is that there's a lot of variability from one moment to the next. If we take the 14-day average, then the reliabilities exceed 0.95 for all of them. We can, in as few as 2 days, which is about 5 minutes of testing, we can get reliabilities between 0.86 and 0.95, which is much higher than a lot of the reliabilities we can get just if we do studies in the lab. We also looked at the discriminant and convergent validity of the tests. We see the working memory test on the mobile, administered on the mobile device, correlates more strongly with lab-based gold standard tests than it does with processing speed and vice versa. So the processing speed measure on the mobile phone correlates with gold standard measures in the lab. And they correlate with the other measures in the lab about as strong as the lab measures correlate with each other. When we did the factor analysis, what I've circled here are the loadings of the mobile tests on the underlying latent constructs that they're intended to represent. And those loadings are certainly in the acceptable range. So we thought we had pretty good evidence of construct validity and reliability for these types of tests, right, administered on mobile devices. Now, this means what we can do is if we take averages across all the repeated assessments, we can get reliable and construct valid measurements, but we can do more than that. What we can do is we can examine, and this is another advantage of measurement burst designs, we can conduct real-time, and that should be in quotes, it's not really real-time, but it's near to real-time analysis of cognition and context. So we can ask how social context affects cognition, whether you're with or alone, with other people or alone. We can look at issues like environmental influences, both sort of their immediate environment, the light, by using the sensors on the phone, but then also by linking GPS information, we can ask questions about whether or not humidity or pollen count on a particular day and time is influencing cognitive function. We can ask about, sorry about that, recent events and social interactions. Is cognitive function worse following a stressful event or an unpleasant social interaction? Then we can look at the effects of natural variations in psychological states, such as affect or rumination. And basically, we do this by looking at the time series of repeated cognitive assessments and seeing how the changes following some type of event or following some type of self-report are associated with those reports. So we look at the coupling or the association across time of events and measures with cognitive performance. So I'll just describe one of the results that we've done, that we've reported, looking at the phenomena of anticipatory stress. So another thing I could have done is just talk about this one paper, so I'm not going to talk too much about sort of the theoretical rationale for doing this, other than to say, in most research on stress, we're very, very focused on your history, whether there's been a traumatic event in the past or a recent stressful event that's occurred. And we haven't spent as much time trying to understand anticipatory processes. And I know for me, I'm more stressed about things that might or might not happen than I am about things that have already happened and done. So we published a paper where we asked the question about whether or not anticipating a stressful day takes a cognitive toll on you. So and here's how we did this. So remember, in the context of this study, people carrying around phones were asking questions. They're doing survey questions at the end of the day, survey questions when they wake up in the morning, then throughout the day doing cognitive tests. So the analysis followed this schematic. At the end of the day, at bedtime, we asked people, one of the questions we ask is, how stressful do you expect tomorrow will be? Okay? And then when they wake up in the morning, we ask people, overall, how stressful do you expect today will be? These are not perfectly correlated. In fact, the within-person correlation is only 0.6. So something has happened overnight. And then throughout the day, they get prompted by the phone and perform these tests. And what we found is that their morning anticipation of stress significantly predicted worse cognitive performance, even when we control for current stress that happened when they were taking the test. What they reported in the evening did not predict it. So there's something true to the adage that you can wake up on the wrong side of the bed. What's also important to note is that the magnitude of this effect is equivalent to a 3-year age difference. So what this means is that if you were to bring a person into a clinic setting and do an assessment, and they were having a bad, stressful day, you bring them in again 2 years later, right? And even though they may have declined cognitively due to aging, if they're not having a bad, stressful day, those two effects will cancel each other out and they'll look pretty stable. So these variations from one day, one moment to the next are large relative to the signal we're trying to look for. Okay. So the last set of empirical findings I'll talk about are some findings that are kind of hot off the presses, looking at how we can use these techniques to study and identify the differences between older adults with and without a condition called mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. This is a clinical condition that is thought to be a precursor or an earlier stage of Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. So these are data coming from the Einstein Aging Study, about 245 people. And note the age range here. These are people between the ages of 70 and 93. 28% of them have mild cognitive impairment, right? So 28% of people have a type of cognitive impairment. Keep that in mind when I report the adherence and the ability of people to use this technology and adhere to the protocol. And also in mind, if you ever try to use technology in a grant application and grant reviewers say, well, can you show, like, older adults can't use this, right? I find those kinds of concern or those kinds of statements odd, and you would never view as acceptable a reviewer saying this other type of group of individuals might not have the mental capability to perform a cognitive test, right, or to use a smartphone. And in fact, pretty much everyone can do this. This is the design of the study. It's a 14-day measurement burst study where in each measurement burst, we're asking so much of these people, right? We attach devices to measure their sleep. We put on wearable monitors to measure their heart rate and heart rate variability to look at cardiovascular function. Then we give them smartphones where they answer questions, do cognitive tests up to 6 times a day for the 14 days. We have not had anyone, including people with mild cognitive impairment, not be able to do the protocol because they didn't understand how to use the software or the phone. We have RAs train them how to do this, but they can absolutely be shown how to do this. And actually it's within rounding error. On average, people complete 89% of the scheduled assessments. They're able to follow the protocol, and there is no difference between MCI and people with and without MCI. So it's about 89% for both of them, which is reassuring, I think, but not too surprising. So let me show you what the cognitive tests are that we're doing. So we're doing the 2 tests that you saw before, this working memory test and this processing speed test, but there were also 2 experimental tests that were specially designed to target the aspect of memory function that we think is most sensitively indicating a deficit in Alzheimer's disease, which is the ability to bind features to objects. Right? So feature binding, memory binding is considered to be a key deficit in Alzheimer's disease. In this paradigm, people see these 3 dots for 2 seconds, they go away, and then they're prompted with the location, and they have to identify which color dot was there. And then after they've done that, then they have to place another dot in the right location by dragging and dropping it. There are a couple different performance indices. The one I'm going to be describing is what we call swap errors, which means when they're answering this question, that they identify one of the other colors that was present but not in that location. Okay. And then here is a test based on a procedure developed by Michael Parra, or no, that's the actor, right? It's another guy named Parra, where you see 3 irregularly shaped objects with colors, then you have about a few seconds to study those, then you see 3 irregularly shaped, those same shapes, either where the colors are of the same shapes, or the shapes are of the same colors as last time, or there's a swap, and they have to indicate same or different. So you have to remember the location of the dot or the color of the object. So just to very briefly summarize the results, what we did, right? So if we give people these tests for 14 days, I mean, they're doing these tests a lot, right? So it's no surprise that we can get reliabilities in excess of 0.95 by aggregating those. So what we'd like to do is portray the reliability that we can get and how many minutes of testing, cumulative testing, is required to hit reliability benchmarks of, that's off, but of the green line indicates how many minutes of testing required to get a reliability of 0.8, and the red dotted line of 0.9. And it takes about 3.5 minutes distributed over a couple days of testing to get a reliability of 0.8 for this test, and in 7.5 minutes we can get a reliability of 0.9. Getting these kinds of metrics for reliabilities can significantly improve the power of our analyses for longitudinal studies, so maybe we don't quite need 9 waves of testing or 1,600 people. The processing speed test showed even we could get to high stages of reliability with less testing. And I'm just showing that colored dot test, because the other test, the colored shapes, has almost the same properties. So in about 3 or 7 minutes, we can get reliabilities of 0.8 or 0.9. When we contrast performance of people with and without MCI, we see all of the tests discriminated at a pretty significant rate. Effect sizes between 0.6 and a little over 1. And I won't show these data, but these effect sizes are as large or larger than the clinical tests that were used to actually identify people as being and diagnose people as MCI or not. So these tests are performing pretty well. Now, just to conclude with some interesting analyses we can do, with these types of data, we just don't have to look at the mean. We can actually look at other indices that are unique to this type of intensive measurement design, such as variability, asymptotic performance, worst performance, or learning effects and time of day. Right? So I'll just show you some graphical results looking at these types of effects in this sample. So this is a graph with comparing the people with and without MCI on the dot memory test, and lower scores are better because it's an error score. So the people without MCI are depicted by this red line, and on the x-axis, this is study day, right? So this effect reflects practice in learning. So they're making fewer errors as the study proceeds, so they're getting better and better at the test. You can see that the MCI folks are not benefiting from practice as much as the people without MCI. So faster learning in the non-MCI compared to MCI, and in fact, the discrimination is better when we compare their practice state compared to their unpracticed state earlier in the study. Another set of findings that I'm really excited about is when we then collapse the data, not daily, but averaged across the 14 days, and we plot the testing as a function of hour of day. Right? So like this is 4 a.m., 8 a.m., noon, 16. We do have some observations there because that's sometimes when people go to bed. What we see is that people with MCI up top are increasing in their response time. So in this case, higher values are slower as the day progresses. People without MCI are decreasing in their response times, getting a little bit faster even, or actually that's not significant. And if you look at memory performance, where this is performance on that color shape test, where this is just an adjusted accuracy, you can really see that the MCI people are becoming less accurate as the day progresses. So if this is pre-Alzheimer's disease, what phenomena might this relate to where people do worse later in the day and toward the evening? Sundowning. So we initially had hypothesized that maybe this could be a way of examining sundowning effects, and it could be fatigue as well, but that doesn't seem to be the case with the non-MCI folks. So these are some of the things we can do with the mobile cognitive testing. The title of my talk said opportunities and challenges. I probably should have spent the whole time talking about the challenges, but that wouldn't have been as exciting. So I'll just do one very quick slide where I talk about all the different things we're trying to work out. There are design and engagement challenges. So we're trying to weigh the brevity of the test versus trying to optimize reliability, minimizing burden, trying to find ways to keep people in the study doing this, discourage cheating. All of these things are areas of research in how to design these types of tests. There are implementation challenges as well. How do we best sequence the assessments to optimize measurement, right? How long should we be doing 14 days, once a day, 3 days, or only 3 days and more assessments? But then there's also a technical issue, which is device variability. For all the data that I've been showing, we give people study-provided devices. We want to use people's own devices. But when you look at the timing latency, the difference in screen sizes, difference in operating systems, this is a nightmare, right? So we have a strategy for trying to deal with this. We're buying every phone that comes out on the market, and we're subjecting it to an intense hardware validation protocol with a robot to look at timing difference, right? So this is the brute force approach to try and figure this out. There are other data mining approaches we can do, so we can ultimately collect information about study devices and see to what extent that systematically affects performance. But this is a non-trivial issue, especially if you want to use these methods in a clinical trial, looking at the effect of a drug. And the bigger problem, right, is that there are no best practices for doing this and no standard procedures for doing mobile testing and no readily available software that investigators can use. So what we're working on now is a project. We're part of what's called the Mobile Toolbox Initiative, and this is funded from the NIH. You can go to mobiletoolbox.org to read about this. We're working with a company called Sage Bionetworks and the Northwestern people, Richard Gerson's group, who developed the NIH Toolbox. They're doing their thing, we're doing our thing, but ultimately this will all come together. And the idea is to provide a common platform for adding cognitive assessments to any kind of mobile health study, whether it's using the software we're developing or software that you're developing in your lab or other commercial software. The timeline is that we are going to be doing validation work in the next couple years, and public dissemination isn't slated until 2023. That said, 2023. That's kind of weird to say. That sounds like the future. Well, it is a future. It sounds like the distant future to me. We do have software right now that is available for use, and if people are interested in this, you can send an email to m2c2@psu.edu, and we can help with that. Ultimately, the deliverables are going to be validated, normed cognitive tests. So if you just want to include tests in your studies, you can do that. There will be apps that you can download that can do cognitive testing and embedded in surveys. But if you want to use your own software, or if you have a company and you want to include these tests, we're going to be making all of this open source so people can put the software libraries in cognitive testing. And something we're super excited about is we've developed, we have the alpha version of a scripting framework that will allow people to develop their own cognitive tests and do their own experiments, even if you don't know how to develop a mobile app. So kind of think of ePrime, better, but also that then can be used and deployed on mobile devices. We're doing a workshop at the Cognitive Aging Conference where we'll be talking about our software platform. The scripting piece will not be ready for widespread dissemination at that point, but we'll talk about how people can use the software in this spring. Okay. So take-home messages. I think we have, and we're not the only ones doing this, I think there's enough data out there and results out there to indicate that we can use mobile devices to obtain reliable and valid indicators of cognitive function. This technology is accessible to older adults, even those with MCI. They can do this. And we have some data that demonstrates we can use these tools in ways that are sensitive to the short-term daily effects of stress, as well as using them to discriminate between MCI and non-MCI. So we're really interested now in some of our future directions is integrating continuous sources of data using GPS and phone use, like how people are using the phones, environmental measures of air quality, and Google Takeout. Who knows what Google Takeout is? Who didn't have lunch with me? So Google, and you know this, right? They have measured, who here has a Gmail account? Okay, so Google knows anything you've ever done since you've had your Gmail account. And you can get access to that now too. If you go to the Google Takeout website, you can download all of this information, every place you've ever been, not what you've done in those places, but kind of creepily close to that. So what you can do if you're doing a study and you want to get historic information on activity patterns, you can get permission to download people's historic data from Google Takeout. So we're working out how to integrate our data with those. And we're also really interested in clinical applications. So our tests and related tests are being used right now in 5 clinical trials. In studies looking at glucose control in diabetics, so people with glucose monitors walking around doing cognitive tests to see whether glucose excursions can be predicted by mental fogginess and vice versa. And then also issues related to fibromyalgia, chemobrain. But what I'm really interested in is using these techniques to improve the detection and monitoring of neurological aging as well as neuropathology. So I'd like just to acknowledge collaborators, and the Stony Brook connections are in red here. So Stacey Scott is a PI on a grant that's which she was part of the ESCAPE project early on, designed a lot of the protocol, is a PI of a grant looking at dementia. And down in the investigative team, you have Stacey, who's here, but then and Giancarlo, who's a postdoc, but also alum from Stony Brook. Alexa Allen was in the master's program, and she's our project manager. Joshua Smythe who was a student here in the 90s, and then Jen Graham England, who was sometime after that, and she's a PI and co-investigator on some of these projects. So I'd like to acknowledge the NIH and my collaborators from Stony Brook and elsewhere. Thank you very much. That's a great question. It was whether or not the reliabilities relate to the diagnosis of MCI. So might the people with MCI be providing less reliable measurements? We don't know yet. We haven't looked at that. That could be a sort of turning lemons into lemonade. If that's the case, it could very well be it's because the MCI exhibit more day-to-day variability and more cognitive vulnerability. That's on our plate. We haven't gotten there. That's a great question. Yeah, so the question is, these folks, so with mild cognitive impairment, one of the kind of soft criteria is that it's really not impacting your functioning in daily. So it's no surprise, right, that people can do things. And the question was, at what point in the disease progression can people stop using the technology? And I don't know, we had 2 people with dementia slip into the study, and they did the protocol. Now, these are obviously mild dementia, but they met the diagnostic criteria. I think what we would need is to think about designing adaptive technology that could be used as people progress beyond that stage. At some point, people will lose linguistic ability and be able to do that. But that in and of itself, if you imagine a home monitoring system, when people stop using software, that could signify, well, maybe we better take a look. So it's a great question. We don't have an answer, but again, it could be actual signal. We hope that's one of these novel digital biomarkers that we hope will be prognostic. So the question was whether the difference in the learning over the 14 days is prognostic of progression over time. So it discriminates people right now, and in some ways, I say, so people have worse cognition don't learn as well as people who have better cognition, but does it actually predict who converts? We're hopeful that it does. This was serendipitous, and these procedures are not really designed well to get at that. My colleague at WashU, Jason Hassenstab, has worked with dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease. He has a protocol that really focuses on this learning piece, and what he's able to show is discrimination in people who are have positive AD pathology in terms of beta amyloid accumulation before they have been diagnosed, right? So I think all signs point to yes, but that we'll wait and see. So the question is, in the conventional approach where you just measure people once, how does that inform what the confidence interval would be, or how is that related to what the confidence interval would be over intensive measurements? And I think you're right, sort of graphically, the difference between the good day and bad day heuristically point to what that confidence limit would be. Now again, the confidence limit is for the mean is determined by dividing by the number of measurement occasions. So you can tighten the confidence limit by getting more occasions. But you're exactly right, that's the right way to think about how that plays out. I hope that answered the question. Looking at these other factors like stress, fatigue, a bad night's sleep is informative in and of itself, but it also can clean up the data, and it really does help gauge how much noise there is relative to the signal. Great. There's a question there? Yeah, that's a great question about, should we measure sort of technology use and yeah, we should have done that. So where were you 8 years ago to suggest that? So and I didn't learn, right? So we're doing another study where we're not measuring that either. We're adding the measure in now. Yeah. And so the one saving grace is that so far what we have been doing is giving them our smartphones with our software that's configured in kind of like a kiosk mode. So, they really just have to press a button. Now, but I know if there's anxiety regarding technology, we don't but should measure that. That's a great point. Yeah. So the question is that there are different types of dementia. We always think about Alzheimer's disease, but another really common dementia is Lewy body disease, and that is characteristic clinically by sometimes people look okay, sometimes they don't. And it depends, and the question was, how would that look in the context of these types of measurement approaches? And it depends a little bit on the cadence of that variability, right? So if whatever is causing the variability in the disease is something that follows a diurnal pattern, then in the data we're collecting, we should look at sort of the within-day variability would be a signature of that disease. If it's something that is following, the cycle of the moon, or something that, like, this week versus this month, we would need a different assessment protocol. So, but we're going to look at these things for sure. We are getting people consent to autopsy, so we will be able to do this kind of fine-grained diagnosis. But as I mentioned before, if you want to really add 10 years onto your life, join one of our studies and agree to donate your brain. Because when you do that, it seems that you last forever. And yeah, but hopefully we'll be able to get at these questions. Yeah, the question was, do we see a way in which this approach could be disseminated more broadly to people in the public, to where this could be used to help people's lives? And so yes, and there are systems now that, so there's a lot of money in this, right? So some of the systems that are out there have leapfrogged past what I view as necessary, the work we're doing now and others are doing now, to marketing. So yeah, I think absolutely we're 5 years away from that, I think. The trickier issue, which I also thought like you might go with this, is we really don't want this used in certain ways. So how else could this be used? To screen people, deny benefits, if you're right, and track, and so there's a lot of ethical issues in terms of how the technology is used. But I think we're about 5 years away from this being a standard clinical tool in this way. Great. Well, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for your questions and your interest.